Welcome, Stevens community, on this third day of March 2021. It is week 8 of our spring term 2021. Welcome to facilitation number 3 of 6 during this spring term. We want to thank the Equity Offices Plus Compliance, which is comprised of ADA Section 504 Coordinator Sadie Mayer Strand, who's also our Director of Student Success Center. We want to thank Shannon Walls, who serves as the Special Assistant to the President and our Title IX Coordinator. And I am Shashawn Dial. I serve as the inaugural Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And our 3 offices together are internally branded as the Equity Offices Plus Compliance. And so it's a pleasure to bring you the 6 facilitation experiences that are spread out throughout the term, 2 each month. So we had 2 last month, and the first one, this entire series, was kicked off by the 2 facilitators we have today, Jill and Rene. And so in case you missed that facilitation on February 10th, you can view it. It is actually on the Stevens ADA page. So if you go to www.stevens.edu/ADA and scroll down, you'll see the video. So we encourage you to check it out, and we'll be sure to put that in one of the wrap-up emails as well. So speaking of today, our third facilitation is brought to you by Jill McClintock and Rene Powell, co-facilitators who are going to share lived and learned experiences on myths, misconceptions, and invisible disabilities, including mental health conditions. So again, this is 2 of 3 different facilitation experiences brought to us by the Services for Independent Living. So a little about our facilitators. Jill McClintock has worked at Services for Independent Living, known as the SIL, for 14 years, supporting individuals with disabilities, seniors, and veterans live independently and in their homes and communities. As education and training coordinator and facilitator of PAVE, or PAV, P-A-V-E, People Advocating for the Voice of Equality, Jill is passionate about learning as well as SIL's vision of creating a barrier-free community for all people. And our other co-facilitator is Rene Powell. Rene is a perpetual student, engaged citizen, disabled advocate, and activist in support of movements that seek to address various forms of oppression and injustice. Rene is a member of the Columbia Disabilities Commission and Public Transit Advisory Commission, a board member of the Columbia Boone County League of Women Voters, a participant and supporter of Race Matters Friends, and previously a member of the Governor's Council on Disability. And before I turn it over, a little information on SIL, the Services for Independent Living. It is a nonprofit center for independent living that promotes independence for persons with disabilities, seniors, and veterans by following the independent living philosophy. The SIL is a part of a network of 22 centers in the state of Missouri. SIL is consumer controlled, with at least 51% of staff and board of directors being individuals with disabilities. Community-based programs, supports, and services are designed to increase independence, quality of life, and economic self-sufficiency with people with disabilities, seniors, and veterans. And cross-disability is accomplished by serving people with all types of disabilities across the lifespan by serving individuals of all ages, and non-residential by not owning or operating any residential care facilities. So Stevens community, we welcome you, residential students, online students, graduate students. Stevens community, we welcome all faculty members full-time and our adjuncts. We welcome all staff members full-time and part-time, all of our amazing alums, and any members from our Columbia community. So as you're able, Stevens community, just send positive energy to Jill and Rene, our co-facilitators for today. Welcome.
You give the best introductions. Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you again for having us. This is the second of 3 presentations that we will do, and we had such a wonderful time last time, and so happy to be back. And I am on my phone as opposed to my computer, because in the Zoom land, my microphone wasn't working, so I had to move over to my phone. So today we're going to talk to you about attitudinal barriers, myths and misconceptions, and invisible, non-visible disabilities, with a focus on mental illness as well. So, and as you have questions, comments, please put them in the chat, and we would appreciate those. So, and the handout was provided in the invitation, and we won't cover everything word for word, but we'll just touch on some of the points in the handout, and of course, answer your questions. So a lot of times people think that the biggest barrier people with disabilities face is lack of a ramp, lack of access, and, other things along that line. And those are certainly barriers, but the biggest barrier that people with disabilities face is attitudinal barriers. So part of what PAVE does is go out and have these dialogues, go out and have these presentations and address some of these attitudinal barriers. Because if we can address attitudinal barriers, we go a long way to creating change overall. And so to open up the discussion on some of the attitudinal barriers that people face, it's kind of the overarching view of a lot of these barriers comes from the viewpoint of ableism, which says disability is not normal, which normal is my least favorite word in the English language, or one of my least favorite words. And people with disabilities are seen as inferior because they aren't meeting the standard of what is considered normal living by somebody without a disability. So I want to have Rene start this discussion, because she's really the one that introduced me to this concept of disability as normal and inferior, and the concept of ableism.
Yeah. Well, one way that I have come to think of it is through the lens of my own disability. I have epilepsy, and the thing about epilepsy that I didn't understand until I was an adult is that everyone has a seizure threshold. Mine happens to be lower, but it's a very normal neurological response to a high fever, or ingesting certain drugs, or in my case, it just happens that my own biological processes or ordinary events can trigger a seizure. But it's a very ordinary event, so it's not necessarily abnormal.
And we talk in a lot of our presentations when we think about kind of an us versus them, idea of people without disabilities versus people with disabilities. We say people with disabilities are the largest minority group, and we're a group that does not discriminate, and anybody can join our group at any time, whether through age or through an accident or other circumstance. So
or temporarily join our group.
Yeah, or temporary, right.
If you have a broken leg, you'll get a sense of what it's like to need access to need environmental access.
Right. So it just puts things in perspective when people think their attitudes about what is considered the norm, and what disability is seen as something that needs to be fixed or inferior, that it really is something that will impact everybody at some point. Rene, did you want to say anything more about ableism before we move on to the specific attitudinal barriers?
Well, I've been, should I talk about the intersection with race?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been reading,
I was hoping you would.
I read Dr. Ibram Kendi's book called How to Be an Anti-Racist. And he identifies specific kinds of racism, including behavioral racism and biological racism. And it's just similar to ableism. It's rooted in an idea that there is a superior body. There is an ideal or a body, and all others are problematic. So that's why we have such common experiences, why we have overlap, that, you know, it all starts with a similar idea of superiority.
And I would say that the same would be true not only with race, but also with gender,
Absolutely.
sex and sexual orientation. So like Rene said, I think that's why we within the disability community feel such a kinship with other groups, because we kind of share that similar experience. All right. So now we're going to dive, if there's any questions as we go along, please put them in the chat. But now we're going to dive into some of the specific, attitudinal barriers. And I want to start with, I think the biggest attitudinal barrier that people with disabilities face, and I will say this doesn't necessarily apply just to people without disabilities. I would say, including myself, that people with disabilities themselves have some of these attitudinal barriers about other people with disabilities. So we don't want to exclude ourselves in, that we don't have these barriers ourselves. So we all learn together. So I think the biggest barrier that people with disabilities can face is the fear that other people have about people with disabilities. You're not comfortable with them. You don't know what to say. You're afraid of saying the wrong thing. You're afraid of not practicing. We talked about etiquette and language last presentation. You don't know how to connect with someone. You don't want to hurt somebody's feelings. You don't want to offend them. And so really our goal is to say, hey, we're people just like everybody else. Be yourself. Approach us as you would anybody. If you're not sure what language or what etiquette to use, just ask us. Just ask us how we prefer to be called, how you can support us. And really, that's simplifying things quite a bit, but really things don't have to be so complicated when it comes to fear. It's just about connecting with someone and getting to know them, disability or not. And Rene, chime in here as you have comments as well, because I'm a chatty one.
Yeah, I can give a specific example of that from my days when I only experienced a non-apparent disability or a hidden disability. I was very reluctant to associate myself with other people with disabilities. And I was certainly immature, and I was passing basically. And I was had taken a position that this was only a small thing in the background, that really is no big deal, that I only have seizures every great now and then. And so I kind of pretended that it just wasn't that big of a factor in my life. And it became more of a problem later on. It became more difficult for me to have control of my seizures. And it was then that I began to seek out the comfort of people who shared my experiences. And it was, one thing I learned early on was that people with mental illness and I have a lot in common, because we take the very same drugs, and the goal of treatment is exactly the same, to find a balance between efficacy and minimizing side effects. So we have very similar daily existence based on that.
And you mentioned passing, Rene, and when we shift over to non-visible disability specifically, we'll touch more on the concept of passing and what that means.
Sure.
Another attitudinal barrier is everybody with disabilities is the same. People with the same disability are the same. The overgeneralization of not treating the individual as the individual. So we always say, if you met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. If you've met one person with epilepsy, you've met one person with epilepsy. There is diversity within the disability community. Not everybody is going to adjust to their disability the same way, have the same attitudes about their disability. To lump everybody together and say, well, everybody's going to be the same is, that is an attitudinal barrier as well. And we talked, I almost said yesterday, but we talked, it seems like yesterday that we talked to you all. So last month we talked about disability being seen as something that should be pitied. You should feel sorry for us. Disability is a tragedy. And then the flip side of that is hero worship. You all are so courageous. You've overcome your disability. You're such an inspiration. Both of those attitudinal barriers are a disservice to us. And hero worship oftentimes is seen as the more positive counterpoint to pity, because of course, if you tell us we're an inspiration, we're a role model for having overcome our disability, that's a positive thing, right? And we've gotten a lot of questions over the years when we do pay presentations that people are still trying to adjust to that mindset of that hero worship is not seen as a positive thing. Now, I said in the last presentation, if you tell me I'm an inspiration, I'm not going to yell at you, get all insulted, because I know where that's coming from, and it comes from my own parents, members of my family as well. So I'm not going to get upset about that, but it's just something to consider. And as with all different types of groups, and in the world in general, there is ignorance. People just assume that because you have a disability, you're incapable of doing certain things. And we'll talk about the independent living philosophy in the next presentation, but you're incapable of living on your own. You're incapable of doing these things because disability is seen from the deficit perspective, as opposed to what people are capable of. And as individuals in general, we should be focusing on strengths, gifts, talents for everybody. But sometimes when you have a disability, that gets lost because people are focusing on what you can't do as opposed to what you can do. Right, Rene?
Yeah. And I look at it in a lot of ways as an opportunity to find different ways or creative ways of doing things. And in that sense, I find a lot of joy in finding these things and figuring things out. And to me, that's a good thing.
And you just triggered something for me, Renee, as along that line is the assumption that yes, you're incapable of doing things, but I think there's the view, particularly maybe by, therapists, doctors, that there's a certain way you should do a transfer. There's a certain way you should do this or that. And what I've spent time with occupational therapy students, sharing my experience with them. And what I've said to them is, I don't want you to throw out your textbooks. Most certainly, they're valuable tools. I'm not going to advocate that you throw out what your professors tell you, what your trainers tell you, what the textbooks tell you. But I'm going to be doing things in my daily life to the tasks that I do and the way that I do them are not going to necessarily be what you will find in a textbook. They'll be incredibly unconventional, almost probably to the point of maybe frightening some people, because I contort my body in all different directions and do things that would probably freak people out. But if it keeps me functioning, if it keeps me at a certain level of independence, that is success for me. And yes, it may not be classic textbook, but I don't really care. Yeah. Because it's my own personal definition of success.
Yeah. One thing I was really delighted about when I started using the rollator was that it made shopping easier. I would go to the grocery store and I'd be carrying all these bags, and now I can just set them on the rollator and attach them to the rollator and go home, and it makes it a lot easier. And it was just, I was overjoyed by that discovery.
And see, some people would think, well, if you moved from being, not needing a walker to moving to a walker, maybe that walker would be seen kind of as a decline for you and not seen as necessarily a positive thing. But the wonderful thing about Rene, for those of you who don't know her well, is she has a way of taking something that is perceived as negative by a lot of people and by society at large and saying, let me put a different spin on that. And it actually is a positive thing for me. And that's why I benefited so much from being around her as a fellow person with a disability. Is we sometimes get into our negative Nancy modes about disability, and she has a way of giving you a whole different spin on life in general. So I appreciate that.
Well, thanks.
Oh, you're welcome. The spread effect we talked about last presentation, the perception that if you're blind, your hearing must be impaired too. Or if you use a wheelchair, or if your speech is affected in some way, you must be mentally impaired in some way. Now, not to say that people don't have multiple disabilities. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're saying is the assumption that just because one aspect of your body is affected by a disability, that means other areas of your body are affected. And the best example I can give of that is, I think a lot of people that are blind would say that you don't need, just because I'm blind and I can't see does not mean that you have to shout at me, because I'm perfectly capable of hearing you. The other thing is, just because I use a wheelchair does not mean you have to speak extra slow to me to help me understand. I'm perfectly capable of understanding what you say. My ability to process information is not impacted by my disability. So just because I'm in a wheelchair does not mean that my brain works differently.
Yeah.
Do you want to
Um,
say something about that, Rene?
Yeah, I recall one time many years ago when I lived in the dorms, and one of my neighbors who I only knew halfway, I had a seizure, and so I was explaining it and talking about it, and she said, "Well, you don't look like you would have something like that." And she meant it as a compliment, but it was really a disturbing thing to hear, and especially when I thought about what she was saying, what that implied about people who do happen to look like they might have epilepsy. And and it was interesting, but I think that's another way of that spread effect expresses itself.
And I had a doctor say to me, "You're so well spoken for somebody with your disability." And I wanted
Right.
to say, wow, that's coming from a medical professional who I
Right.
would imagine has seen many people with disabilities and knows the diversity of people with disabilities, and they still have that attitudinal barrier of "you're so well spoken." And I know it
Yes.
was meant as a compliment, but it just kind of gave me just kind of an uncomfortable feeling, especially coming from a doctor who is supposed to know better, you would think, but a lot of the barriers come from doctors. Um,
Yeah,
Go ahead, Renee.
there are a lot of assumptions built into the medical community. I noticed it's a very common experience among people with disabilities, I've found.
And that reminds me that I think you were with me, Renee. We went to, and I was really excited about this. We went to speak to a group of medical doctors,
Uh-huh.
and it was one of the most, I don't know how it was for Renee, but it was one of the most uncomfortable presentations I've ever given, because
Mhm.
everybody just kind of sat there stone faced, no questions, no interactions. And in fact, on some of the surveys, people were like, you told me stuff I already knew. You didn't give me anything new." And I'm like, oh, so close-minded to think that you're going in and you learn nothing. You learn nothing from, I mean, not to say our presentations are all that, but you would think you would learn something.
Right. Yeah. You would think after they had gone to the or gone to the trouble to set it up, they would find something of value, at least try.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, are there any, are we getting any comments? I think I thought I saw a comment in the chat, maybe?
Absolutely. Well, speaking of
Okay,
value, Renee and Jill.
yeah.
So Salissa in the chat said, Renee and Jill, thank you so much. As someone with autoimmune disorders, which are invisible in many ways, I deeply appreciate this meaningful presentation and support.
Mhm.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for sharing. I know disability disclosure, and I know you're doing it over chat, but disability disclosure is a very personal decision. So thank you for sharing your experience. I appreciate that.
And you do have a couple questions have come up so far.
Okay.
So one of them was, it says, Jill, you mentioned a transfer. What's a transfer? I think it's when you were speaking about, your independence and creatively
Yes.
navigate the world.
Yes. So, and thank you for that question. Sometimes we throw out terms that we just assume people know, and that's the beauty of these presentations. So when I refer to transfer, so another misconception is I use a wheelchair, so I'm confined to my wheelchair and I never get out of it. I'm in it 24/7. No, not true. I'm able to transfer out of my chair, out of my chair into bed, going to the bathroom. So when I talk about a transfer, I'm talking about how I get from my chair to somewhere else. And everybody's going to transfer differently because everybody's going to have different levels of ability and different modifications to help them do what they need to do. And some days transfers go like a breeze, and other days it's like I feel like I'm 80 years old and my muscles do not want to do what they need to do. So it's a lot of patience and grace with myself, and a lot of, as Rene said, creativity and figuring out a plan D, E, and F sometimes, and forget the plan B. Any other questions, comments? Okay, so am I freezing up or can you still hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, good. Okay. Backlash is the view that those people with disabilities are always wanting something. They're always, and I think that's the way it is with other, I think we get very marginalized. I mean, everybody, you know, and you say, well, this group is always wanting something, and they're never happy, and they're wanting special treatment. So I wanted to talk about that term for a second. No, we do not want special treatment. What we want is equal opportunity, equal access. There's a difference. I am not special. Well, I'm special because I'm a unique human being, but I'm not special because of my disability. And I don't want you to treat me any different than anybody else. But if I need an accommodation to help me to do my job, or if I need a ramp to get into a building, that's not because I'm expecting you to treat me special. I just want you to give me the same opportunities as anyone else. And I've told my former boss before, on the job, it is up to me as a person with a disability to disclose my disability if I need an accommodation, to disclose my disability and ask for what I need. If I don't ask for an accommodation, one, or if I get an accommodation and it still does not work, I do not expect you to keep me as an employee if I'm not doing my job, if I'm not meeting the same productivity standards as everyone else, just because I have a disability. That would make me feel like crap. And the same when I was in school. Even though I had some hard classes, I didn't want anybody to pass me. Not that I flunked any of my classes, but I didn't want anybody to pass me or give me a pass in any way because I had a disability. Question. I'm not seeing the full question. Something about college?
Yeah, we'll go there in 1 minute, but there's
Okay.
a question that came in, I think that
Okay.
complements what you were just talking
Sure.
about, which a question came in that said, how would you answer resistance that came in the form of someone thinking, like an attitudinal barrier, that granting accommodations in middle school or high school or college shouldn't happen because folks won't get those in the workplace? So have you heard that before as an attitudinal barrier?
That what you get in school is not what you're going to get in the workplace?
Exactly. I think that's the heart of the question.
I mean, all I can really think is just a general concept is when I was in high school, people would say to me, we spoon feed you in high school, wait until you get into college. And then when you're in college, wait until you get into the real, quote unquote, real world. It'll be a wake up call for you because you won't have this or that. I really didn't notice a major shift between being in school and being in the work world as far as what I did and didn't get. but I think it's very maybe individual specific based on your needs. And I think the good thing about accommodations is I think a lot of people don't even realize the amount of accommodations that are available to them and what is considered an accommodation. So it's really thinking about outside the box and having that communication with your supervisor and saying, because requesting an accommodation is a very interactive process where you investigate your resources, you talk about what you need, and maybe it's not in the conventional list of what you would see as an accommodation, but as long as it's not an undue hardship to the employer financially or impacts their business in any way, you can really, really think outside the box. And when it comes to the support and accommodations you need. I don't know if that answers the question.
Fantastic. I think it definitely speaks to it. And I think it's an attitudinal barrier, right? That someone could possess of like, oh, if I grant something now, they won't have that, which the truth of it is, we hope that the individual would have the agency to advocate for their accommodation, and that the workplace would be more than willing to meet that accommodation.
And this isn't an accommodations, that isn't our sole topic, but the other thing I will say about that is the other key question you ask about it when it comes to accommodations is, you have to be clear on when you read a job description and it says certain things and you're like, well, because of my disability, I can't do XYZ. It says you must have a driver's license. I don't drive. So does that mean I don't apply for jobs that say driver's license? No, what I do is I ask, is this an essential function of the job? Because maybe it isn't an essential function. Maybe it's just a marginal function. And in that circumstance, I could still do the job because they restructure the job in such a way to allow me to do it because certain things are not essential. So don't automatically discount an opportunity because you're focused on the parts of the job that you can't do, because you never know how it can be restructured and what's essential and what's not.
Fantastic. And then, yes, there is lots of activity in the chat, so let me catch up there. So yes, another question said, do college-age students deal with challenges? And if so, what can Stevens do to assist them? And I'm going to go ahead and ask this other question so you all can answer it together, which a question came through that said, why are there so many students with accommodations now? It didn't used to be that way before.
Rene, do you want to touch on those?
Well, I think there's a few reasons. One reason is that there have been adjustments in diagnostic criteria for autism and autism spectrum and things like that. Which changed the number of people who were diagnosed, while they may have fallen through the cracks previously. And also, it was not until the 1970s that people were allowed to go to mainstream schools, and then that was a limited experiment. And going on to college was another. And then the Americans with Disabilities Act was not passed until 1990. So we're behind. We're playing catch up.
And I think there's just I think there's a real push you know, people with disabilities, I think in general, are kind of seen as, at least in my case, seen as very passive. You just kind of settle for what you're given, and you make do with
Yes.
what you're given, and you feel almost like, if I ask for something, tying back into that attitudinal barrier, I'm going to be seen as a burden, or that I'm being troublesome, that I'm asking for something. I think there's a real push that asking for what you need is not a selfish act. And
And also I didn't know what I had access to when I was growing up. The medications that I took, the side effects affected my thinking ability. And I qualified, because of that, I was able to have extra time on my tests, but I didn't know about it until after I graduated college.
Yeah.
So, you know, that a lot of people just don't know.
and I think professors do a pretty good job of mentioning, you know, when they do their syllabus, mentioning at the beginning of class, you know, if you need an accommodation, you know, come see me, visit your disability
Right.
services office. And of course, you know, their place is not to say, okay, I see a student with a disability in my class. Let me after class, let me meet with them and say, do you need an accommodation? That really is not their place to do that. The responsibility lies on the person with a disability to ask
Right.
for what they need.
And like I said, I was trying to pass, so I
Yeah.
was trying to pretend I did not need these things too.
And I think too, we've talked, this is in the handout later on. I think there's this view of, and Rene, you can speak to this as well, the view of the hierarchy of disability. Who's
Sure.
who's more disabled than somebody else? So I'm more disabled than Rene because I use a wheelchair, and I'm entitled to more supports and accommodations than Rene because of my disability. And Rene's not as disabled as I am. So there's almost like this
Right.
competition exclusion type thing of who belongs in the disability community and who doesn't. And of course, there's a disability definition. You know, of what there is a definition of disability under the ADA, but just kind of this view of who's disabled and who's not. And that's where we get into the passing piece.
Yeah.
And let me check and see how we're doing on time. We're good on.
It's 1:17 p.m.
Yeah, I think we should probably move away from unless there's other questions about the attitudinal barriers, I think we should move more into now the invisible mental health piece.
Sure,
sorry
I'll
if
just
we
share
did not
this,
give it.
Jill, from a member of the community who said that they have a temporary handicap tag, even though their injury was several months ago, and they have found that that they're questioned when they use their tag because, quote, they look fine. However, people don't understand that there might be underlying pain for this individual when they're walking too far or moving. And so they wanted to share the point that things aren't always as they appear, that those decisions lie between a patient and a doctor. So I just wanted to make sure that thank you for the contributor to our community, because I think it tied right beautifully into that.
Yes, thank you for that. And that's such an awesome point. And it brings me to Rene introduced me to a t-shirt long ago that I actually purchased. Do you know what I'm talking about, Rene?
Yeah, I do.
You want to tell them about that shirt?
Yeah, it says I'm just in it for the parking. It's sort of mocking the assumptions that we get all of these special perks for by being disabled, we get perks.
I thought that was one of the most genius things I'd ever heard, and it's kind of a running joke with me. You know, I'm just in. So you just, you know, I'm just in it for the parking, and you know,
right.
and so so let's move on to non-visible disabilities. And Rene, talk a little bit more about the passing, and talk maybe a little bit about, you know, the choice to disclose your disability, because, but again, the assumption by looking at you, you're not disabled.
Well, I'm not walking. If you saw me walking, you would see that.
Mm-hmm.
Because I have a little bit of a limp that throws my gait off. So you can see that part of my disability now. Prior to that, you could not see it because unless I actually was having a seizure. But there were things that you couldn't see going on, like I would be having double vision half the day because of the medication side effects. And so it was always there, and it was always impacting my life significantly, but other people couldn't always see it.
Right. Right.
And there was always a risk I was living with too, of having a seizure, because I would, and for that reason, I can't drive. And not being able to drive itself is somewhat disabling.
And I don't have the option of passing. The only thing I will say is I do have panic attacks and anxiety that can be severe at times, and I feel like sometimes I'm passing in that regard. And I find that sometimes it's harder for me to talk about non-visible mental health issues than it is what you see. I'm much more open about what you see in my cerebral palsy than I am what's going on in my head. But
different kind of stigma. Yeah. The stigma is distinct.
Do you think, Rene, that the stigma of mental illness, I think it has gotten better, but I think we still have a long way to go. Wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I think there's a very distinct stigma, and certainly the media has done people no favors by, you know, criminal shows. They're always speculating about mental illness, and they put out a lot of stereotypes and things, and so, and it's very, very difficult for people to self-identify, because there are some really wrong assumptions out there.
Mm-hmm. Well, and some of the assumptions I put in the handout is the problem lies within the individual.
Right.
There's a flaw with you. You're lazy. You just need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and try harder. That it's a weakness within you, or you're just flat out crazy.
Right.
And we throw that, and that's a kind of a debate about language. We throw the word out. I mean, people in general throw the word out all the time. That's just crazy. Or and I guess the discussion of, you know, do we use that word too much, or are we being too sensitive about that word when we just, because it's a word I have used in conversation, like, oh, it was a crazy day.
Yeah.
So
I like to substitute like chaotic or something like that. I work really hard to avoid that word.
Yeah. I've been more mindful of it since we've had these discussions, and you know, being mindful of language. And so the other thing I will say about mental health and, passing and all that is, I don't want people to feel that they have to pretend to be something they're not. To fit a norm or a standard. I just hope that people in general can be more open and honest about, what they're going through, their individual experiences, how they may be hurting, how they need to be supported. Because anybody that's not living, whether it be disability or otherwise, anybody that's not living their truth, and that's one of the saddest things for me. It's just an individual that cares about people and cares about the world, as I want people to feel that there's nothing to be ashamed of. There's nothing to be ashamed about when it comes to disability, and particularly on disabilities that you can't see, and mental illness. There's nothing to be ashamed about. And I've had conversations with family about my struggles with anxiety, depression, and the view that I needed to pull myself up by my bootstraps and not resort to medication. But what I've said to my family is, you have no issues if I do therapies or medications for my cerebral palsy, but when it becomes something mental, then all of a sudden medication's a cop-out. Mental illness is no different. It shouldn't be treated any different than any other illness we have, as far as the support and the treatments that people need.
Right. And that's one of the things. That's where epilepsy is like the perfect intersection for that. That it's a brain thing. And it's that's why some of the same medications are used for seizure control and for bipolar disorders, because the idea is to settle, to even out the brain activity. So there's it's the same thing to me. So I see it as, it's hard to, we aren't used to seeing neurological events or our moods as physical events. But from my perspective, I always do, just because that's always been my life. Or since I was 14.
I think one final point, because I know we're short on time, is the whole thing with non-visible disabilities is the idea, well, you seem fine one day and then the next day you're not fine. And I think this assumption that, if you're fine one day, it should be consistent across the board how your disability manifests itself. Because for me, the CP, my disability is pretty much the same unless I'm ill or in pain, and then that makes my more challenges in how it comes across for me. But with non-visible disabilities like MS or brain injury, some days are going to be better than others, and depending on the environment you're in, and what you're encountering, behaviors, feelings,
the weather
emotions are gonna be all over the map, and people just don't realize that they don't get that shift from the change that it can occur. Are we did we do good? Did we get to do good on our time?
You did fantastic on time, and thank you for being fluid and flexible to go off of some of those branches, right, that were based on the questions that were submitted, and this just the phenomenal chemistry between you two. So thank you for that. It is 1:29. So if either of you would like to, share maybe a parting thought, and then I'll just quickly wrap up with one or two announcements.
Rene, why don't you wrap us up with parting thought, because you take conversations in directions I wouldn't even think to. So you did.
I think I'm spent, Jill.
Okay, I put too much pressure on her. I guess the overarching point I will make about this is when we talk about all of this, and I said before in the last presentation, examine your own, your own attitudinal barriers. And that includes me as an individual examining my own attitudinal barriers, because you can't address barriers unless you acknowledge they exist, and then kind of talk with other people, do that self-reflection on where that barrier stems from and why you feel that way and what you can do to change it.
Yeah, I guess I would also add that it all begins with the attitudinal barriers, because it requires required a change in attitude to start building ramps.
Yeah, exactly. And
So
if you want to change attitudes, come to the next Human Library event. Check the public library website. March 20th is our next Human Library event, to break down those stigmas and get to meet somebody different than you.
Jill, you are so smooth. Thank you.
And
That was the perfect segue and transition. We did share that information with our community last week. So when we did the wrap-up email from our February 24th facilitation by the Center Project, we also put the link in for the Human Library Project for March. So well done.
Oh, you're on it. Thank you so much. And thank you for, I hope it's okay to say thank you for attending the first inaugural one that we did. It was great to have you there. And I wanted to speak to you personally, but there were many other people there, but I did see you.
Yes, no problem. It was the same. I know you were navigating in many capacities. And so that was a fantastic event. I did come back and share that with our senior leadership team, and they were really receptive. And I think, everybody who doesn't have a schedule conflict is going to participate in the next one. So very excited about that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
No problem. And speaking of next, Stevens community, thank you all of our students, staff, faculty, board of trustees, alumni, and community members who attended this. Our next one will be March 31st, so the last Wednesday of this month. And we will have Catherine Jenkins will be with us, and she's going to do a facilitation on multiple generations in the workplace, right? So how we celebrate each generation, and then also how we create inclusive workplaces for multiple generations in the workplace. So we're very excited about that. And Rene and Jill, you are more than welcome to attend that. I can send you all the links. We want to thank Lita.
Thank you so much
for always being our technology guru and coordinator.
Yes, thank you, Lita.
Thank you, Lita.
Very much.
We want to thank Rene and Jill for sharing 60 minutes of your lived and learned experiences. We thank you so much for contributing as we shift at Stevens into even more of a culture of learning and growing and embracing diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we know you'll be back with us in April for our part 3 of 3, and we look forward to that so much. And thank you
so much for having us. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. This has been the most fun I've had doing these PAVE presentations, I think, since I've started, is this experience that I've shared with you all. So thank you. And thank you, Rene. You're awesome.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So we'll see both of you back in April, and Stevens community will be back in touch with the wrap up from this event, and then definitely be on the lookout in your emails for our listening sessions from the incredible work of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council as part of our DEI strategic plan process. So thank you all so much, and we send you positive vibes and stamina for midterms. So good luck, students, on all your midterms, and we send grading stamina to our faculty. Everyone, have a great middle and end of a week 8. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.